Welcome, A-Pushers! Today what we're going to talk about is Anglicanization, that's a mouthful, the First Great Awakening, and Enlightenment thought. And so the first thing we're going to talk about is royal centralization. And that's what's going to lead to a lot of the problems, as we said, that salutary neglect age, where the colonists felt that they were kind of being left alone. It's similar to, remember that feeling of not having your parents around and then all of a sudden them coming back and setting up a whole bunch of new rules. You were used to those freedoms. So King James II wanted to be this absolute monarch, and he did lots of these little things, just a bunch of little things to the colonies that they weren't used to. He forbade New York to call their own assembly. He forced all voting in the colonies to be based on property ownership. He established this Dominion of New England instead of individual colonies, and these colonies liked that they were a part of something, a colony, a state. They were proud of that. They didn't want to be a part of a larger group of colonies quite yet. He required religious toleration, and we will get to later why he does that. He forced them to observe the Navigation Acts. We looked at those last class, and that mercantilist policy. He consolidated all of these northern colonies into one great northern colony, the Dominion of New England, which once again they're not going to be psyched about. Added New York and New Jersey to this Dominion of New England and put Sir Edmund Andros in charge, eventually something that the colonies are going to grow to disdain. So after this, James II, who is a Catholic, very important to note, his daughter Mary was a Protestant. Now, people tolerated the fact that he was Catholic because his daughter, who was in the line of succession, she would be queen, would eventually take over and restore Protestantism. But when he has a son, things are going to change. And Mary and her husband William, like the college, as we know, William and Mary, are going to come together and overthrow James, her father, in what comes to be known as the Glorious Revolution. The reason this is important for the colonies is that the colonies as a whole are very happy with this. So that's going to lead them to some of that Anglicanization because they're going to be very proud to be English again, especially in the Northeast, who had been put in this Dominion of New England. Once again, this is very important. Dominion of New England, who is being led by this Sir Edmund Andros character. Andros is arrested. King William completely does away with this Dominion of New England. And so colonists are very grateful to England, and they're proud to be English. Okay, so what's important here is that this Glorious Revolution really helps create the rise of their own colonial assemblies, their own colonial governances. Even more so than they had, it kind of validated them that they were doing the right thing in practicing their own forms of government. So they saw themselves as their own form of an English government or parliament, the House of Commons. They were, for the most part, self-governing, except in just trade, printing money, and declaring war. Those are the only pieces that they were truly required to go back to the crown. For the most part, they entirely governed themselves. As expected during this time, the elite really dominated politics. Most could not afford. There was no payment for being in politics, and so it was only the wealthiest. This was the 1% all over again. And it's 1 to 2% of the population, but they could afford to do that because they were lawyers on the side. They had good trade jobs. They had time to do this, but most could not participate. And so, as would be expected, non-whites and women are barred from voting at this time, mostly white landowning males, which is around 30 or 40% of the population that could vote. And one of the biggest colonial political battles is going to establish some American underlying ideals, things that we think of as commonplace today. And this John Peter Zenger trial is vitally important. It is a landmark case. Not a Supreme Court case because we had not established that yet, but his lawyer, John Peter Zenger, Andrew Hamilton, not Alexander Hamilton, and not his father, just no relation, his lawyer, Andrew Hamilton, goes forward before this British court, this British judge, and argues that Zenger, who had been tried for libel or writing out against the government, was that it wasn't libelous, because this wasn't about whether or not he had done it, because he came forward, Zenger, and said, yes, I did do that. I wrote these, I published these things against the government. And technically that was libel. That was illegal at the time, but his lawyer Hamilton argued that that was not the issue. The issue was liberty, and the liberty to have that freedom of the press. So John Peter Zenger trial, the way that what you should think and connect that to is the freedom of the press. If you're thinking of Zenger, immediately think that First Amendment right, what we have now, was not established yet, as we didn't have a constitution, but freedom of the press was established in many ways, looking back at the John Peter Zenger trial. And so as we move forward, we'll think about everything in regards to these two overarching issues of reason and emotion and the battle between these two. And so we see these two men, Alexander Garden and George Whitefield. Garden, more of an Enlightenment thinker, a Protestant, but believes more in the old school version of it, versus George Whitefield, who is an emotional man, who could bring forward this new awakening of thought. And so this conflict between these two, their arguments, their writing back and forth, is going to showcase everything that we're going to do for the rest of this discussion, that difference between reason and emotion. Those two European major cultural currents that are going to make their way over to America in the mid-18th century and lead to that Anglicanization. Right, and so we see the Enlightenment and the First Great Awakening come out of that. So we'll start with the Enlightenment, which represents more of a reason. The most educated individuals who came over from Europe, Anglicanized, they had ideas about these specific advances, human intelligence over superstition, and they brought reason with them. We talked about the age of exploration, and now we've really moved into this age of reason. And so this is that 18th century Enlightenment, and it's working its way over to the colonists, and the ones that they pay most attention to are mostly Poor Richard's Almanac from Ben Franklin, and John Locke's essay concerning human understanding. These are the two major impacts for the colonists. And these are not extremely religious individuals. They were deists, which had this belief that almost like a clockwork God created the world, but then left the world to natural law, and that science, other than religion, should rule, reason and not emotion. On the other hand, the Great Awakening is about emotion. European Protestant revivalists came over from especially Great Britain and spread a lot of these ideals of emotion with religion. It's no longer as stoic as it used to be, and it unleashed a lot of these anxieties that people had. They were not in a society that was ordered. They were not in a society that was even safe a lot of the time. So it released a lot of anxieties about what they should and should not do to be saved. We see Jonathan Edwards' Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, which we'll be reading soon. You see George Whitefield, one of the most famous preacher that inspired thousands of conversions across the land. And so we see the lines drawn and what's most important between these new lights and these old lights, or rationalist clergy versus the revivalists. The new lights are the new ones, and so they're able to paint themselves as forward thinking. We're emotional, we're a revivalist, we're going to be saved, versus the old light, which are kind of they saw as stodgy and rationalist first, devotion to religion and less to their relationship to their God. And so this opens up a split in American Protestantism. Really, Anglicans lost membership. Baptists and New Light churches are going to be the ones that are gaining most of the membership. So it kind of, people are not as dedicated to their religion as they used to be. And a lot of this comes back to that, as we said, not reason, but emotion. Right? When we're talking about Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, this is where we get this is the birth of those modern day revivals that we think of. When you think of intense religion with people talking with saints or passing out because of speaking in tongues, and people just dropping in the crowd out of their religious fervor, that all comes back to these original American preachers, right? These giant revivalists like Jonathan Edwards, who gave one of the most famous sermons that you'll be reading for homework called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. It's like sinning, we as sinners are like spiders being dangled over the pit by the hand of God. You see, there is nothing that keeps wicked men at any one moment out of hell except for the pleasure of a loving God, right? And so they really are using that emotion to scare people into being religious, but they're scaring a lot of religion into people as well. And so in that Great Awakening, it contributes as a whole to a lot of a weakening of actually officially established denominations, right? So what that really does is that it increases religiosity, but it decreases religion. So you notice that ITY, religion, religiosity, is people are very spiritual, people are more intense, but they're actually less devoted to their individual religion. Okay? They're more focused on the spirituality of things. So they're not as focused on denomination. So that's going to, think about how that might break down places like Massachusetts that are very Puritan, that kicked Anne Hutchinson out for being different. So remember how this contributes to the weakening of officially established denominations. Very important. And this is going to lead to a lot of thought processes, right? This is going to be combined in some ways with the thoughts of the Enlightenment to lead towards new intellectualism, right? If religion's going to take on a very intellectual side, in Princeton, Columbia, Brown, and Rutgers are going to be founded out of this fervor. These revivals spread also beyond white society. They spread into Native Americans, African Americans, and women begin to play a much larger role in society because of the Great Awakening. They now have a role to play. The expectation that women are there to help out in the household and raise their children, but also in a part of the community to help out with these revivals. So women take a lot more of a role in society. So there's some very positive impacts of these Great Awakening. So it doesn't really produce a political ideology per se, right? Like American political ideology isn't born out of this, but it definitely lays a groundwork for it. Okay? Individuals are going to believe passionately about this. And think about Anne Hutchinson, think about George Whitefield, Jonathan Edwards. They're not ascribing to the way things used to be. They are passionate about changing the way things were for the better because of what they believe in. They are being dedicated to a cause, which sounds an awful lot like the American Revolution. So in many ways, we're going to see an emergence of a national character because of this. Okay? It's not just governing, but it's the rights to free speech. It's the right to free press. It's Anne Hutchinson. It's the Zenger trial. It's governing themselves in the Northeast. It's a lot of different things that emerge that are begin to lay the groundwork for how we're moving towards the American Revolution. All of these things work together to build what will become American culture. They become very accustomed to governing themselves, electing their own representatives. Remember, after James II, when William and Mary take over, there is no more dominion of New England. That comes and goes very quickly. Religious tolerance becomes much more something that's a part of America, right? Northeast was not very tolerant of religion initially, which is why we lead to Rhode Island and Pennsylvania. But after this Great Awakening, people become more tolerant of a variety of religions. And that first Great Awakening is going to blur the lines between the different types of religion. So it becomes more of a Protestant religion and less devoted to, well, I'm a Puritan, well, I'm a Quaker, well, I'm this, and I'm a Catholic. So people are going to be much more devoted in general, but less to their religion. Okay. So remember the difference between the North and the South. The North still is beginning to have a more democratic societies, egalitarian, town meetings. In the South, sheriffs govern counties in the South, and they're very much governed by those plantation owners. So as a whole, think about this as kind of your impact page, emergence of a national character. That's the real impact of all of this, the difference between reason and the combination between reason and emotion and how those lead together to kind of form what America is going to become eventually. So you're starting to see those seeds of what America will become, right? I will see you guys in class. Much love, folks.